We have a verdict in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case after all these weeks. And if you thought that was the only major decision of the day, you'd be wrong. We're going to talk about what happened on this absolutely monumental day in court. Racketeering conspiracy not guilty, sex trafficking of Cassie not guilty, sex trafficking of Jane not guilty, transportation to engage in prostitution Cassie guilty, transportation to engage in prostitution Jane guilty. That was the historic verdict out of the courtroom today, a split decision after nearly 13 hours of deliberation and weeks of testimony and evidence. The 12 jurors acquitted Sean Combs of the most serious charges, the ones carrying potentially 15 years to life, but convicted him onto Mann Act charges which each carry up to 10 years. The government has indicated in filings that the recommended sentencing range is 51 to 63 months, or approximately 4 to 5 years. However, there's no mandatory minimum, which raises the question, could the judge go lower? Would the judge impose the sentences consecutively? That's another open question. A lot is still uncertain, and if that weren't enough, we also had a bail hearing today. After the verdict, it became a question of whether Combs should be granted release. While awaiting sentencing, he's been held since September 2024 and has been denied bail each time. But given the partial acquittal, the defense argued that circumstances had changed. Elizabeth Milner, who has been closely covering this case from inside the courtroom, shared her reaction to the verdict. She admitted she was surprised, especially at the acquittal on the sex trafficking count related to Cassie Ventura. The jury had asked specific questions about her testimony, which suggested serious deliberation, given the emotional tone in the courtroom and Diddy's more subdued demeanor yesterday. It had seemed a conviction on at least that count was possible. As for the guilty verdicts on the Mann Act charges, those were less surprising. Testimony and evidence had laid a clear foundation. Regarding Jane, her testimony had certain ambiguities, and the jury didn't even request a readback, suggesting they may have made up their minds quickly. As for Combs' reaction, he appeared visibly pleased with the outcome, not overjoyed, but relieved. He mouthed a quiet thank you to the jury, and his family showed signs of hope that he might come home soon. His defense team was clearly satisfied that the most severe penalties had been avoided. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense and chaotic. Supporters chanted in favor of Combs, hopeful he might be released that day. There were heated debates, especially around Cassie's accusations. Some argued the government was unfairly targeting a successful man who gave back to the culture. There were even bizarre moments, such as someone spraying baby oil and splashing a reporter. Courthouse security had to step in to maintain control. Now on to the bail hearing. Later in the day, the judge held a hearing to determine whether Sean Combs should be released on bail pending sentencing. The burden was on the defense to prove that he wasn't a danger to the community or a flight risk. But in the end, the judge ruled that Combs must remain behind bars. The judge noted that Combs was convicted of 2 felony counts under the Mann Act, which trigger mandatory detention. The judge also pointed out that the defense itself had conceded during trial that Combs had been violent, especially in the case of Cassie Ventura, which the judge saw as significant. He referenced the now infamous 2016 hotel surveillance video and the court transcripts where defense attorney Mark Agnifilo described the conduct as domestic violence. The government had argued that Combs continued engaging in violence and criminal activity even after federal agents raided his properties in March 2024. They cited new violent conduct involving Jane in June 2024, less than a year before trial, as evidence he posed a continuing danger. The judge, while denying bail, made a point to say that he takes no position yet on the length or severity of sentencing. As for sentencing expectations, the defense is asking for 21 to 27 months, pointing out that Combs has already served almost a year. The government is advocating for 51 to 63 months based on guidelines and the severity of the offenses. The prosecution indicated that a pre-sentencing investigation report (PSR) is still needed. This report helps the judge decide on a sentence, examining the defendant's background, health, finances, history of substance use, and the offense itself. It includes interviews with the defendant, victims, law enforcement, and others. The PSR is standard in federal cases and is viewed as essential, though the defense wanted to waive it for a quicker sentencing. Prosecutors doubled down, saying that Combs' wealth and brazen behavior shouldn't entitle him to different treatment. They argued he remains a serious danger, shows no remorse, and has a long history of violence and substance abuse. The government also revealed something not explicitly mentioned during the trial, that Combs invited Jane to the hotel room where he was ultimately arrested, allegedly with drugs and lighting already set up, which prosecutors say demonstrates premeditation. Defense attorney Mark Agnifilo strongly pushed back. He asked for an expedited sentencing, offered to waive interviews, and argued that Combs had already served considerable time. He compared Combs' case to others where defendants accused of far worse were released pre-sentencing. He even cited the former New York governor who used prostitutes and was never charged. But the judge wasn't swayed. The next hearing is set for Tuesday, July 8th and will be remote, meaning Combs will not appear in person. Sentencing is scheduled for October 3, 2025. In the aftermath of the verdict, Cassie Ventura's legal team submitted a letter asking that Combs not be released, citing concern for the victim's safety and the community. Another letter came from Deontay Nash, a witness in the case, who wrote that Combs remains an immediate threat due to his pattern of violence, substance abuse, and influence. Finally, while the government didn't release a statement celebrating the verdict, they did release a statement emphasizing the seriousness of sex crimes, the courage of survivors, and the ongoing commitment of federal agencies to hold perpetrators accountable. The statement avoided commenting on the verdict but reiterated their broader mission. This marks a pivotal turning point in the case. While Diddy avoided the most serious charges, he still faces prison time. What the judge ultimately decides will determine whether this partial legal victory amounts to long-term freedom or continued incarceration. More to come as the July 8th hearing approaches, and all eyes will once again turn to the court for what could be the final chapter in this headline-grabbing trial. What unfolded in the courtroom wasn't just a final gavel strike. It was the culmination of months of public scrutiny, explosive allegations, and a legal process that held one of the most powerful names in entertainment accountable under the full weight of federal law. But make no mistake, this wasn't a clean win or a total loss for either side. What happened was something far more nuanced, more combustible, a split decision that left everyone from victims to fans to legal experts debating what justice really means. In the age of celebrity power, for many watching this case unfold from the moment the first charges dropped in late 2023 through the televised hearings, the bombshell testimonies, and the surprise evidentiary reveals this day marked a kind of collective exhale. A verdict had finally arrived. But as the dust settles, what's becoming increasingly clear is that the ripple effects of this case are just beginning. Inside the courtroom, tension, strategy, and a surprising turn. Let's start with the atmosphere. Inside the courtroom, tense, thick with anticipation, and tightly wound after weeks of high-stakes argument. Throughout the trial, the defense maintained a steady rhythm, hammering away at inconsistencies in testimony while carefully conceding points they knew could not be denied. They admitted to violent behavior but carefully framed it as domestic strife, not criminal enterprise. They acknowledged troubling relationships but distanced them from any broader pattern of sex, trafficking, or organized misconduct. But the prosecution, led by Homeland Security and the U.S. Attorney's Office, came in determined to demonstrate a clear pattern of coercion, drug use, manipulation, and control. They weren't just trying to prove isolated acts, they wanted to prove a criminal ecosystem, a deliberate exploitation ring led by Combs. In the end, the jury's split decision told its own story. They didn't buy the full narrative of organized crime under RICO, but they did find credible the specific acts of transporting women for sex, and that carries weight. The Mann Act, which prohibits the transportation of individuals across state lines for purposes of prostitution, may not carry the headlines that RICO or sex trafficking do. But it's serious, it's not symbolic, and in the federal system, it carries real sentencing weight, up to 10 years per count with no guarantee of leniency. The shock and silence of acquittal on racketeering and sex trafficking. Still, the acquittal on the sex trafficking and racketeering charges sent a jolt through the room. These were the cornerstone charges. The racketeering conspiracy count was supposed to demonstrate that Diddy wasn't just participating in individual acts of violence. He was orchestrating an enterprise built on abuse, fear, and control. Prosecutors had invested heavily in that framing, hoping to link the disparate accounts of Cassie Jane and other witnesses into a coherent narrative of systemic misconduct. So when the jury returned not guilty on racketeering, it was a blow, not just legally but emotionally. It left prosecutors tight-lipped, their statement carefully avoiding any commentary on the verdict itself, instead praising victims and reiterating their broader mission. For Cassie Ventura, whose presence loomed large throughout the trial, even in absence, the verdict offered only partial vindication. Her civil case against Combs had already sent shockwaves, with the release of disturbing surveillance footage that showed Combs violently attacking her in a hotel hallway. That video, which the defense did not even attempt to deny, became a cultural flashpoint, sparking wider conversations about violence against women, accountability, and the limits of celebrity influence, still despite that visceral footage and testimony pointing to a larger pattern of control and trafficking. The jury ultimately stopped short of convicting Combs on those higher charges. Whether that decision was rooted in reasonable doubt, legal technicalities, or juror discomfort with broader interpretations of trafficking laws, it's something we may only learn if jurors choose to speak publicly. Diddy's reaction, a glimpse of relief in a sea of uncertainty when the verdict was read. Sean Combs didn't erupt, but he did show something rare: vulnerability. Throughout the trial, he maintained a confident, almost casual courtroom presence, occasionally smiling, nodding, exchanging quiet words with his legal team. But today, as three of the most severe charges were read as not guilty, his posture shifted. He mouthed a quiet thank you to the jury, and his family, including son Justin Combs, visibly exhaled. Still, that brief moment of hope was quickly dampened by the judge's next decision. No bail, a firm judicial rejection of freedom before sentencing. In the hearing that followed, the defense argued vigorously for bail, pointing to Combs' acquittals, his celebrity status, his strong family ties, and his lack of prior convictions. They offered to waive pre-sentencing protocols in order to move up the sentencing date. They even suggested that further incarceration before sentencing would be punitive. But the judge was unmoved. He pointed to the statutory guidelines, reminding the defense and the public that under federal law, conviction on certain felonies requires mandatory detention. Moreover, the judge cited the defense's own admissions during trial, repeated references to domestic violence, acknowledgments of emotional and physical abuse, and the widely viewed hotel surveillance video that depicted Combs striking Ventura in a manner that could only be described as violent and predatory. Even without the racketeering or trafficking convictions, the judge made clear that the underlying facts of the case and Combs' own conduct raised serious red flags. He referenced not just past behavior but recent incidents post-dating the HSI raid, suggesting that Combs remained a danger to the community. The decision: no bail. Combs would return to MDC Brooklyn and remain in federal custody pending sentencing. Sentencing fight looms from expedited freedom to maximum time. While Combs' team pushed for a sentencing range of 21 to 27 months, citing what they claimed were lesser facts than other Mann Act cases like pimps exploiting minors or mass brothel operations, the government countered with 51 to 63 months, just over 5 years. The prosecution emphasized Combs' wealth, power, access to drugs, use of staff in facilitating prostitution, and most damningly, his lack of remorse. They argued that his actions were calculated, repeated, and shielded by his fame, and that the sentence should reflect that. The defense tried to paint Combs as fundamentally different from those other cases. Not a pimp, not a trafficker, but a man with deeply personal, if toxic, relationships. They pointed to comparable cases where defendants were released or given reduced sentences, including elected officials. They even brought up the case of a former New York governor involved with prostitutes who wasn't charged at all but once. Again, the judge was unmoved. October 3, 2025 remains the sentencing date unless the court agrees at a hearing on July 8. To expedite it, that hearing notably will be held remotely, with Combs appearing via video. Letters to the judge, voices of fear and accountability behind the scenes. The court received powerful letters from victims and witnesses urging the judge to deny bail. Cassie Ventura's lawyer argued that Combs remained a threat to those who testified and to the public at large. Deontay Nash, a witness during trial, submitted a letter describing Combs as an immediate threat, with a pattern of violent behavior, substance abuse, and psychological intimidation. These letters reflect something beyond the courtroom walls: the trauma, the lingering fear, and the deep emotional toll that Combs' conduct has allegedly inflicted on those in his orbit. The public divide, chaos outside the courthouse. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, things were more volatile. Supporters and critics of Combs clashed loudly. Some called him a victim of government overreach. Others accused the justice system of going too soft. The scene bordered on absurd, with baby oil spraying, verbal disputes, and makeshift barricades. Media crews dodged chaos, security braced for escalation, and no one knew whether Combs would walk free that day. He didn't. But the circus-like atmosphere, part celebrity culture, part protest, part voyeurism, served as a jarring reminder of how blurred the line between justice and spectacle has become. Where things go from here, October 3rd and beyond. As of now, the sentencing stands for October 3rd, 2025. But legal maneuvering could change that. If the defense gets its way, we could see a sentencing hearing as early as late July or August. Much depends on the upcoming July 8th hearing, where both sides will argue whether expedited sentencing is appropriate. But even if Combs receives the Minimum sentence: the time already served, nearly a year, means he could see freedom sooner than expected. Still, the damage to his brand, his reputation, and his influence is incalculable. Music collaborations have dried up, public support has fractured, streaming services have quietly pulled back, fashion endorsements have vanished. What remains is a shadow of the mogul who once ran Bad Boy Records and stood shoulder to shoulder with industry titans in the court of public opinion. That's a separate sentence, and arguably one that could last far longer than 63 months.